The Farmhouse Lights. I've always hated the stillness of the farm at night. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, as if the wind itself held its breath, waiting for something unspeakable to happen. For years, nothing ever did, until that summer. The first night we saw the lights, I convinced myself it was a trick of the eyes, some reflection from the old weather vane twisting in the breeze. My wife had laughed it off, called me paranoid. The kids didn't notice, of course. Teenagers have a way of missing everything unless it's on their phones. But something gnawed at me that night as I lay in bed, unable to sleep. It was the cows. They'd gone quiet. For anyone who's lived on a farm, that's the first sign something's wrong. No lowing, no shuffling in the barn. Just dead silence, so thick it pressed against your chest like a weight. I remember rolling over, whispering to my wife, but she was out cold. I decided to check on the animals. There's comfort in routine when the world feels like it's tilting off its axis. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the shotgun from the corner, and slipped outside. The night air was heavy, humid enough to slick my skin in seconds. The lights were gone now, but something else had taken their place. A faint hum, like the buzz of cicadas, only deeper. It seemed to vibrate through the air, low and constant, just on the edge of hearing. It set my teeth on edge, and I gripped the shotgun tighter as I headed to the barn. Inside, the cows were different. Not dead, not sick, but standing there, wide-eyed, their breaths coming in shallow, ragged puffs. They were all staring at the back wall of the barn as if something was waiting there, just outside the beams of my flashlight. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead, but when I swept the light over the stalls, there was nothing. Nothing I could see anyway. That was the first night. The second was worse. We were sitting at the dinner table when the lights came again, cutting through the windows in long, eerie beams. This time there was no mistaking it. They were too close, too unnatural. My wife dropped her fork, eyes wide, and I knew she saw it too. I stood, moved toward the door, but my daughter, always so quiet, always so distant lately, was faster. Before I could stop her, she'd pushed past me, rushing into the field. I called after her, but my voice felt small in the vastness of that night. The lights pulsed, brighter now, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed across the ground. She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. By the time I made it to the field, she was gone. The air around me was thick with that same hum from the night before, only now it was louder, vibrating in my chest, rattling my bones. I stood there, panting, searching the fields, but there was no sign of her. Nothing but the swaying wheat and the thick, stifling darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight. Then the lights vanished. Just like that, the sky was dark again, the hum gone, and the stillness returned. But it wasn't the same. I wasn't the same. We searched for her, of course, for days. I called the sheriff, our neighbors, hell, even a search party from town came out. But after 3 days, there was no trace. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she'd been swallowed whole by the earth itself. And then on the 4th day, she came back. I'll never forget the sound of the front door creaking open. It was just after sunset, and we were sitting in the living room, lost in our own quiet despair. The sound snapped us all to attention, and there she was, standing in the doorway, pale and silent, like she hadn't been missing at all. She didn't say a word, just stared at us with eyes that seemed wrong. Her pupils were too wide, her skin too pale, as if the blood had been drained from her. My wife rushed to her, hugged her, cried into her hair, but I couldn't move. I couldn't speak, because something was off. I could feel it, deep in my gut. Our daughter was back, but she wasn't our daughter anymore. That night, the cows died. I found them the next morning, bloated and stiff, their eyes wide with terror, mouths open in silent screams. There was no blood, no signs of an attack. Just dead. But the worst part? The lights came again that night. Brighter, closer, and this time they weren't alone. After the cows died, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Something was wrong with our land, something we couldn't explain, something that no one else could understand. We kept to ourselves after that. The neighbors, once friendly and always around for a chat, stopped coming by. Not that I blamed them. Word travels fast in small towns, and the sheriff's half-hearted investigation into my daughter's disappearance didn't exactly help us regain anyone's trust. And then there was our daughter. She didn't talk about what happened during those days she was gone. Hell, she didn't talk at all. She would sit for hours, staring blankly out the window at the fields, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the glass. At night, we'd hear her pacing the upstairs hallway, her feet shuffling slowly, almost rhythmically, as if she were counting each step. But it wasn't just that. It was the things I'd catch her doing. At first they were small, barely noticeable. I found her standing in the barn one night, staring at the empty stalls where the cows had been. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there for what felt like hours, her back to me, the faint outline of her figure barely visible in the dim moonlight. When I called her name, she didn't answer. The next morning, I found symbols carved into the wooden posts of the barn, jagged and crude, like something a child might scratch into the dirt. They weren't words, not in any language I recognized, but they had weight to them. Looking at them made my skin crawl, like they weren't meant to be seen by human eyes. That was when I started locking my door at night. My wife, bless her heart, was still convinced our daughter was just lost. She'd say it over and over, whisper it to herself when she thought I wasn't listening. "She'll come back to us, she's just lost." But I could see it in her eyes, the fear. The same fear that twisted in my gut every time I heard those lights humming in the distance, every time our daughter sat at the dinner table and stared at us with those two wide eyes, her fork resting untouched beside her plate. The nights grew colder. The lights came more often, flickering just beyond the hills, and each time they came, I'd feel that same pressure in the air, like something heavy was pressing down on us, suffocating the house, wrapping its unseen fingers around our throats. Then came the scratching. It started as a faint noise just outside the windows, like tree branches scraping against the glass. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it grew louder, more deliberate. One night, I stood in the living room, shotgun in hand, listening as the sound traveled around the house. Whatever it was, it moved slowly, dragging its claws across the walls in a circle, tracing the perimeter of our home. It knew where we were. It knew we were inside. And it was waiting. When the scratching stopped, I heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, as if something large was moving through the fields outside. I rushed to the window, heart pounding in my chest, half expecting to see one of the neighbors or a stray animal. But what I saw, I wish I hadn't. The lights had come again, brighter this time, so close that they bathed the fields in an eerie glow. And there, just on the edge of the light, I saw them. Figures. Tall, thin, impossibly thin. Their limbs too long, too sharp, standing motionless at the tree line. Their faces, if you could call them that, were featureless, their heads tilting slightly as they stared back at me, though I couldn't see any eyes. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, anything but what I knew deep down was real. They were watching us. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, shotgun across my lap, listening to the quiet, to the hum of the lights in the distance, to the silence that followed. I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse. But how do you leave when the thing you fear is inside with you? In the morning, I found my wife in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn, staring at our daughter. She hadn't come down for breakfast, hadn't moved from her room. My wife's voice trembled when she asked me to check on her, but I could see the dread in her eyes. She already knew something was wrong. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step echoing through the hallway like a hammer in my head. My hand shook as I turned the doorknob, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open, revealing the small, dimly lit room where our daughter slept. Except she wasn't there. The bed was neatly made, her clothes still draped over the chair by the desk, the curtains drawn. But she was gone. And then I saw the floor. Symbols, dozens of them. The same jagged, twisted marks I'd found in the barn, now covering the hardwood floor, carved deep into the boards. I stared at them, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then the scratching started again, this time from above. I looked up, and that's when I heard the faint, wet sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ceiling, moving slowly toward me. I knew I shouldn't have looked, but I did. And what I saw up there, clinging to the ceiling like a twisted, nightmarish thing, was not my daughter. Not anymore. I froze. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. There, clinging to the ceiling, was the thing that used to be my daughter, if you could still call it that. Her limbs were bent at unnatural angles, long and spindly like the twisted branches of a dead tree. Her head tilted to the side, those two wide eyes staring down at me, pupils blacker than the night, blacker than the void. But it wasn't just the way she moved. or the way her body contorted. It was something deeper, something primal that twisted my insides and made my skin crawl. She blinked slowly, a deliberate and calculated movement, like she was measuring me, deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. I backed out of the room, step by agonizing step, trying to keep my eyes locked on her. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a deafening drum in my ears. Her mouth twitched, opening just enough to let out a slow, wet exhale, almost like a sigh. I closed the door, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grasp the knob. For a moment I stood there, my back pressed against the wood, trying to convince myself that I hadn't seen what I'd just seen. But the scratching continued, soft and rhythmic, from the ceiling above. I stumbled downstairs, nearly tripping over the last step, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My wife was in the kitchen, her face pale and tight, her eyes wide with fear. "She's not in her room," I managed to choke out, the words catching in my throat. I didn't tell her about the thing on the ceiling. I couldn't, but I didn't need to. She knew. She must have known. That night, the lights came back. Brighter this time. Closer. I sat in the living room again, shotgun across my lap, listening to the low hum that had become almost familiar, though it was anything but comforting. Outside, the lights flickered in the distance, their beams sweeping across the fields in wide, deliberate arcs. They were searching for something, and I knew they'd found it. The scratching started again, this time from the walls. Not above, but around us, circling the house like some unseen predator. My wife stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and unblinking, her hands gripping the doorframe so tightly I thought she might break her fingers. We didn't speak. There were no words left to say. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap on the front door. I flinched, gripping the shotgun tighter, my palms slick with sweat. My wife turned to look at me, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound came out. Another knock. Louder this time. More insistent. I stood, my legs shaky beneath me, and moved toward the door. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it, but I had to. I had to know. I reached for the knob, my fingers trembling, and slowly I pulled the door open. The figure standing on the porch was bathed in the cold, eerie light that flickered from the sky above. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. Tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes that clung too tightly to his body, his skin pale and waxy, like something left out too long in the sun. His face was wrong, too smooth. His eyes were black, just like my daughter's had been. He smiled at me, though it wasn't really a smile, more like a twitch of the lips. "Is your daughter home?" he asked, his voice low, almost melodic, like the hum of the lights. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stepped back, instinctively raising the shotgun, though I knew it would do no good. He didn't flinch, didn't react. He just stood there waiting. My wife came up behind me, her hand gripping my arm, her breath shallow and quick. "Who is it?" she whispered, though I could hear the answer in her voice. Before I could respond, the man took a step forward, crossing the threshold, his body moving with unnatural fluidity, like something that wasn't quite used to being in human skin. "She's been waiting for you," he said, his eyes flicking toward the stairs. "She's ready now." I didn't understand what he meant, but my blood ran cold. My wife let out a small, broken sob, and I turned to her, ready to pull her away, to grab her and run. But it was too late. I heard the creak of the floorboards above us, slow and deliberate, as if something was moving through the upstairs hallway, and then she appeared at the top of the stairs. It was my daughter, or the thing wearing her skin. She moved slowly, her limbs too long, her head cocked at that same unnatural angle. Her eyes, those black, endless eyes, fixed on us as she descended the steps, her feet barely touching the ground. The man turned to her, his lips curling into that same grotesque smile. "You've done well," he murmured, his voice dripping with something that made my stomach twist. "It's time." I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had to stop it. I raised the shotgun, my hands shaking, and aimed it at the man. But before I could pull the trigger, he turned his head toward me, those black eyes locking onto mine. "You can't stop this," he whispered, his voice slithering into my mind, wrapping around my thoughts. "It's already begun." And then the lights outside flared, blindingly bright, filling the room with their cold, sickly glow. I heard a scream, my wife's, and then nothing. The lights flickered once, twice, and then they went out. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. My wife lay crumpled on the floor, her eyes wide and unblinking, her lips frozen in a silent scream. And my daughter, my real daughter, was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't know what to say, because I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Not until I figured out what was coming next. I stood frozen, my daughter's voice barely cutting through the fog in my head. The image of my wife's lifeless body burned into my mind, her last scream echoing in the dead silence that had fallen over the house. But the girl in the doorway, my daughter, the real her, was trembling. Her eyes wide with confusion and fear, the blackness that had once consumed them gone. She was back. "What's going on?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step toward me, her voice small and fragile, like it could shatter any second. I wanted to run to her, to pull her into my arms, but something kept me locked in place, a deep, gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach. Was this another trick? But then, she did something that shook me to my core. She cried. Real human tears. And in that moment, something inside me cracked wide open. Is she... She started, her voice breaking. I dropped the shotgun, the heavy clatter barely registering as I rushed to my daughter, pulling her into my arms. The warmth of her skin, the sound of her sobs, it was all too real, too human to be part of the nightmare we had been living in. For the first time in days, I felt like I had my daughter back, and I clung to that feeling like a drowning man. "Shh, it's okay. It's okay," I whispered, though it wasn't. Not yet. My eyes flicked toward my wife's body on the floor, and grief twisted through me like a knife. But I couldn't lose myself to it. Not now. There was something bigger happening. I had to fix this. The lights outside flickered again, casting long, twisted shadows through the windows. The air seemed to hum with a low, pulsating energy. I could feel them watching us. The figures, the beings that had taken her. They weren't done. But something had changed. The control they had over her was breaking. I could feel it. And if they could bring her back, maybe, just maybe, there was still time to save us all. "Stay with me," I said, pulling her back so I could look into her eyes. They were clear now, but the fear in them was raw and real. "Whatever happens, don't let go." She nodded, her lip trembling, and I grabbed her hand, turning toward the door. I wasn't going to let those things take her again. The lights grew brighter, the hum rising to a fever pitch, and the front door slammed open with a violent gust of wind. Standing in the doorway was the man, the one who wasn't really a man. His face was as smooth and expressionless as ever, his eyes like black pits staring into our souls. "This ends now," I said through gritted teeth, pulling my daughter behind me. The man, or the thing wearing his shape, didn't speak, but I felt the air tighten, felt the pressure building. He was waiting for something. And then I realized he was waiting for me to give up, to hand her over. That was the deal, wasn't it? But I wasn't playing by their rules anymore. "Whatever you are," I said, stepping toward him, my voice shaking with a mix of fear and rage. "You don't belong here, and you're not taking her. Not again." For a moment, the air seemed to crackle with tension. And then something incredible happened. The man took a step back. The lights outside flickered wildly, and the figures at the edge of the field seemed to shudder, like they were unsure of what to do. They weren't as powerful as I had thought. Their control was slipping. Suddenly, my daughter squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes wide with realization. "Dad, the symbols," she whispered. "In the barn, they weren't meant to hurt us. They were meant to protect us." I stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. The carvings, the strange markings, they weren't part of the terror. They were a shield, a barrier to keep whatever these things were out. I didn't fully understand it, but it didn't matter. We had to act fast. "Come on," I said, pulling her with me as I grabbed a lantern and ran toward the barn. The hum of the lights grew louder behind us, the ground beneath us vibrating with the energy of whatever those things were. But we kept moving, faster now, desperate to get to the one place they hadn't fully breached. The moment we stepped into the barn, everything shifted. The symbols carved into the wood seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a strange light of their own. The air inside was still, safe, as if the barn was immune to whatever was happening outside. The figures at the edge of the field hesitated, their long, spindly forms flickering in and out of sight. The man stood at the door, his black eyes watching, but he didn't step inside. He couldn't. "This is it," I whispered, turning to my daughter. This is how we end it. Together, we worked through the night, carving the same symbols, deeper, stronger, into the walls of the house, the doors, anywhere we could. With each mark, I felt the power of those things weaken, felt their grip on our lives loosen. By the time dawn broke, the lights were gone. The figures in the field had disappeared, and the strange hum that had haunted our nights was no more. It was over. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, my daughter and I collapsed in the kitchen, exhausted but alive. She leaned against me, her breath steady, her eyes clear. We had survived. I looked down at my wife's body, grief washing over me again, but this time there was a strange peace. I knew she hadn't died in vain. She had given me the strength to fight back, to save our daughter, to break the curse that had taken hold of our farm. We would mourn, we would heal, and we would move on. The farmhouse was quiet again, but this time it wasn't a silence filled with dread. It was the kind of peace that comes after a storm, the kind that told me we were finally safe. And for the first time in weeks, I knew we would be okay.